Are you an overcomer? You know, as I've been working on this study of the book of Revelation, I've had to ask myself this: am I an overcomer? Or do I allow the things of this world to kind of take me down and beat me up and knock me around? I think this is a very serious question. And if you look at the letters that Jesus wrote to these churches, these 7 churches listed in Revelation, this is a pretty big deal for him. You know, we're going to look over the structure of these letters because I think it's really important for us to understand what he was doing, and that Jesus was very consistent in how he talked to the churches in these letters. And so we have some commonalities within the letters, some things that he included in all or most of the letters. First of all, he always identified the church. He said, to the angel of the church of Ephesus or Philadelphia or whatever. Then he identified himself, and he didn't just say, hey, this is Jesus. No, what he did was he identified the portion, the facet of his God personality that spoke to the need in that church. I think that's very powerful that we look at it in that context. He also said, I know your works. He's saying, I see you, I know you, I know what you're doing. For some, he said, nevertheless, this was not a good thing. Nevertheless, I have this against you. And he starts listing the things where they are not lining up with his word, with his will for their life, where this church is not on target the way that they need to be. They're missing the mark. And then sometimes to encourage them, I think he would say, but this you do have. He would say, yeah, you're doing this, but this you do have. Then he gives them instructions. Each church has a different set of instructions. And then at the end, the final part, these last 2 things that he includes in every letter are the 2 things that I want to hit on hardest today. The next one is he who has an ear to hear. I think that this is so important. He says in every one of the letters, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. God is looking for a people that has an ear to hear what he has to say. We need to be listening for him. We need to be paying attention to what he's trying to tell us. And as churches as a whole, as individuals, we need to look at these letters and evaluate ourselves compared to what Jesus said to the people in the churches in these letters. Powerful stuff that he says, important things that he's confronting them on or commending them for, that we need to make sure that our life is lining up with that. And so this brings us to our very last thing that we're going to say. To him who overcomes. To every church, he said, to him who overcomes. To those churches that overcome. To those individuals that overcome. And I'm going to just briefly kind of take you through the things that these churches had to overcome. You know, to overcome is to conquer, to overcome, to be victorious, to gain control of, to defeat. And as Christians, we need to be living an overcoming, victorious life. You know, the church in Ephesus had to overcome the fact that they had lost their first love, their passion. Smyrna had to overcome the fact that they were facing intense persecution. Pergamos had to overcome a spirit of compromise that had come into the church, which included sexual temptation from outside of the church. They were looking at the world, they were looking at the things going on, and Jesus was calling them to account and saying, listen, you got to confront this. Thyatira, this church was confronted by Jesus over their corruption, for allowing the controlling Jezebel spirit to come in and to control and to take the place of the Holy Spirit in the life of the church. This church was also confronted for their sexual immorality. Have you noticed 2 churches in a row here have been confronted because of their sexual immorality? The first church from sexual immorality and temptation from without the church, from outside the church. But in Thyatira, it says that it was temptation from within the church, that the leaderships were telling people that it was okay to do these things. Let that sink in for a minute. Let that one sink in for a minute. Sardis was confronted and they needed to overcome the fact that Jesus told them that they were spiritually dead. Some of our churches are just plain dead and unfruitful. Philadelphia, He wasn't confronting them with anything that they were doing wrong, but he was just saying to them to hold fast. They were a church that was in a rough, horrible environment. Jesus called it the synagogue of Satan. It was the very center of satanic activity in their area. And yet they were still fighting, still holding on, even though they had little strength. They had to overcome that. And then Laodicea had to overcome their lukewarmness to where God was wanting to just spew them out of his mouth. But there are promises when we overcome. To Ephesus, for overcoming their lack of first love, they were promised that they would get to eat from the tree of life which is in heaven. Think about that one for a minute. The opposite of that would be not being in heaven. To overcome persecution for Smyrna means that they would not be hurt by the second death. In Pergamos, to overcome that spiritual compromise, that compromise from without, they would be given a new name, a new reputation. They wouldn't carry that sexual immoral reputation anymore. Thyatira, who was told to overcome corruption, would be promised a powerful mantle of spiritual warfare, authority, to where they were given power over the nations, and they were given the power of the morning star, which is the power of Jesus rising up in them. You know, they were overcoming that Jezebel spirit, so that gave them power in spiritual warfare. Sardis, for overcoming spiritual death. They would be clothed in white, and their name would not be blotted out of the book of life. That means that your name can be blotted out. Philadelphia, holding fast. They were to hold fast, living in a bad environment. And so they would be made an authority in the temple of God, a pillar in the temple of God. They would have the name of God, of Jerusalem, of Jesus, and would be given a new name and new authority. Laodicea, for overcoming their lukewarmness, would be able to sit with Jesus on his throne. He is calling us to overcome. And there are consequences to not overcoming, and there are consequences to overcoming. Keep that in mind. Be an overcomer.